He brought laughter to millions, but no one could hear the cries of a single man. For roughly a decade, during his time as the internationally acclaimed drummer for Crowded House, Paul Hester played to tens of thousands in packed arenas, theaters, and festival grounds across the globe. Millions of people loved him for his smile and his humor, but there was a number no one knew: the decades he fought a lonely battle against depression. He was the happiest man in a room of 20,000 people and perhaps the loneliest when he came home. This is the story of the cruel arithmetic of fame, the story of a man who warmed the world but froze to death in his own silence. To truly understand Paul Hester, you must first understand the world that forged him. It wasn't the slick corporate music machine of Los Angeles or the hallowed, history-steeped scene of London. This was Melbourne, Australia, in the 1960s and 70s. For much of its history, Australia had been in the grip of what its own writers call the cultural cringe, a lingering post-colonial feeling that anything of real artistic merit had to come from somewhere else, namely Britain or America. But by the time Paul was growing up, that was changing. A new, uniquely Australian identity was roaring to life, and nowhere was that roar louder than in the pubs and clubs of its major cities. This was a nation coming of age, an island continent defined by what was often called the tyranny of distance. Geographically isolated from the epicenters of Western culture, Australian artists had to work harder, shout louder, and be more resourceful to get noticed. This isolation bred a fierce, do-it-yourself creativity and a healthy skepticism of pretense. The result was a music scene that was raw, powerful, and utterly authentic. It was the era of the pub rock boom, a circuit where bands weren't judged on their image or their record label, but on their ability to make a room full of rowdy, beer-soaked workers move. Bands like AC/DC, Cold Chisel, and The Angels were its pioneers. Their music was loud, blues-based, and stripped of all frills. It was visceral, sweaty, and honest. The stage was not some elevated platform for untouchable gods. It was a battleground, just a few feet away from the audience. To survive, let alone thrive, you couldn't just play your songs. You had to perform. You had to connect. You had to entertain. You had to win the crowd over night after grueling night on the sticky carpets of corner pubs from St. Kilda to Fitzroy. This environment demanded a specific kind of musician, one who was not only skilled but resilient, charismatic, and completely devoid of arrogance. It was the perfect crucible for a personality like Paul Hester. Paul Newell Hester was born into this world on January 8, 1959. His childhood in the Melbourne suburbs was, by all accounts, a stable, loving, middle-class existence. There was no great tragedy or poverty in his backstory to fuel a desperate artistic ambition. But there was something else, something far more foundational. There was rhythm, in a detail that is so often lost in the footnotes of his life, but is absolutely central to his story. It has been widely reported that Paul's mother was a jazz drummer. Think about that for a moment. In the deeply conformist, male-dominated Australia of the 1950s and 60s, a woman playing the drums was a rarity, a quiet act of rebellion. It meant that rhythm was not just a hobby in the Hester household. It was a language. It was part of the fabric of his home life. We can imagine a young Paul not being told to practice scales on a piano, but instead absorbing the subtle syncopated swing of a hi-hat, the gentle whisper of brushes on a snare drum. He was learning about dynamics, feel, and the crucial importance of the space between the notes before he could even articulate it. Jazz was his first musical dialect, a foundation of subtlety and groove that would later allow his rock and pop sensibilities to flourish with a unique musicality. While other kids were outside kicking a football, Paul was instinctively drawn to this world of beats. He wasn't one for formal lessons or the rigid structure of music theory. He was a natural, a sponge. His education came from the radio, from vinyl records spun until their grooves were gray. He absorbed the sharp melodic pop of the Beatles, the raw swagger of the Rolling Stones, and the unique, energetic pulse of the Australian bands he could go and see for himself in the flesh. He was learning that a drum beat could be more than just keeping time. It could be the entire personality of a song. It could be Ringo Starr's joyful, understated swing, or Charlie Watts's impossibly cool, minimalist groove. He got his first drum kit as a boy and began the process of teaching himself. This wasn't a casual pursuit. His room became his laboratory. He would spend countless hours with headphones on, not just playing along to his favorite songs, but deconstructing them. He was breaking down the DNA of a beat, trying to understand why a certain fill worked, why a drummer would choose to hit the crash cymbal in one moment and stay on the ride in another. He was developing his ear, his timing, and his intuition. He was building the toolbox of a professional musician piece by piece in the quiet solitude of his suburban bedroom. By the time he was a teenager, that solitude was no longer enough. The primal urge to play with other people, to create a sound bigger than himself, took over. This was the mid-1970s, and the Melbourne music scene was a vibrant, sprawling ecosystem. Paul dove in headfirst, joining a succession of local bands whose names are now lost to the mists of time. This was his apprenticeship. This was where he learned the real-world craft of being a drummer. It was a world away from the glamour of rock stardom. It meant lugging a heavy kit in and out of the back doors of smoky pubs. It meant setting up on cramped stages where the lead singer's microphone stand was an inch from your face. It meant playing to rooms that were sometimes packed and appreciative and other times depressingly empty, with only a handful of indifferent drinkers for an audience. It meant long drives down the Hume Highway for a poorly paid gig in a country town. It meant dealing with dodgy promoters and even dodgier PA systems. It was a relentless, unglamorous grind, but it was also an invaluable education. He was learning how to lock in with a bass player, how to read the energy of a room, how to hold a song together when everything else was falling apart. He was also learning how to perform. Watching the great pub rock frontmen, he saw firsthand that musical skill alone wasn't enough. You had to give the audience a show, and Paul, with his natural wit and boundless energy, was a quick study. Even from behind the drum kit, a position that usually keeps a musician visually and sonically in the background, he began to shine. He was the guy who was always smiling, always moving, always connecting with his bandmates and the crowd. He was discovering that his personality was just as powerful an instrument as his drums. By the early 1980s, Paul had worked his way up the ladder of the Melbourne scene. He was a known quantity, a reliable and talented drummer for hire. His most significant project during this period was a band called Deck Chairs Overboard. They were a departure from the raw, bluesy pub rock that dominated the era. Their sound was more in line with the new wave and post-punk movements coming out of the UK. Cleaner, more melodic, with quirky synths and angular guitar lines. They were a popular draw on the inner city circuit, releasing a few independent singles and building a loyal following. For Paul, it was another crucial step in his development. Playing with Deck Chairs Overboard refined his style, forcing him to be more precise, more disciplined. He learned to play with a click track in the studio to craft drum parts that were intricate and clever without being overplayed. He was becoming a complete musician, equally at home in a sweaty rock club or a polished recording studio. The band had all the ingredients for success: good songs, a strong local following, a modern sound, but for whatever reason, they never quite broke through to the national level. The big record deal, the hit single, the massive tours, it remained just out of reach. For any musician, this is a dangerous time. It's the point where the dream can start to curdle into disillusionment. You've paid your dues, you've honed your craft, you've put in the 10,000 hours, and yet the doors to the next level remain closed. It's the moment when many decide to pack it in, to get a real job, to relegate their musical ambitions to a weekend hobby. Paul was approaching his mid-20s, an age where, in the fast-moving world of pop music, you could already feel like a veteran. He was respected in his hometown, but he was still, in the grand scheme of things, a nobody. He was at a professional crossroads, weighing a future in music against the quiet pull of a normal life. And that's when the phone rang. The call was an invitation, an opportunity that felt like it came from another universe. One of the most successful, most respected, and most creatively ambitious bands to ever emerge from the Australasian music scene was looking for a new drummer. Split Enz were not just a band, they were an institution. Formed in New Zealand in the early 70s, they had evolved from a bizarre art rock collective with wild hair and theatrical makeup into a sophisticated, world-class, new wave pop group. They had conquered Australia, had hits in the UK and across Europe, and were known for their brilliant, eccentric songwriting, courtesy of the brothers Tim and Neil Finn. To get a call from Split Enz was akin to a young actor getting a call from Martin Scorsese. It was an invitation to step into the major leagues. The band was in a state of flux. Their longtime drummer had departed, and they needed someone to fill the seat for what was to be their final major tour and recording sessions. Paul's reputation as one of Melbourne's finest had reached them. He was invited to audition. We can only imagine the mix of terror and excitement he must have felt. This wasn't another pub gig. This was a chance to share a stage with his heroes, to play songs that he, like everyone else, had heard all over the radio. He went to the audition and did what he did best. He played the songs. He didn't show off. He didn't overcomplicate things. He listened. He locked into the groove, and he brought his own unique energy to their well-known material. And of course, he was himself. He was funny. He was charming. He put everyone at ease. He got the gig. In 1983, Paul Hester, the kid from the Melbourne suburbs who had learned to play in his bedroom and paid his dues on 1,000 sticky carpets, officially became a member of Split Enz. He was stepping onto a moving train, but this one was traveling at lightning speed. Suddenly, he was on national television. He was flying to gigs instead of driving. He was playing in massive concert halls to thousands of adoring fans. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. He joined Split Enz in 1983, stepping in for their final major tour and contributing to their last recordings, most notably on the See Around album. It was a whirlwind, a masterclass in professional musicianship at the highest level. But the most important thing that happened during that time wasn't the fame or the big shows. It was the human connection he made. In the creative crucible of the tour bus and the recording studio, he forged a deep and lasting friendship with the band's youngest member and principal songwriter, the quiet, prodigiously talented Neil Finn. They were in many ways a study in contrasts. Neil was the introspective, often melancholic genius, the crafter of intricate melodies and poignant lyrics. Paul was the extroverted, life-of-the-party rhythm man, the joker who could break any tension with a well-timed wisecrack. They were the yin and the yang, and they clicked instantly. In late 1984, after a final farewell tour, Split Enz officially disbanded. For the Finn brothers and the other long-term members, it was the end of an era, a chance to rest and reflect on an incredible journey. But for Paul, it felt like he had only just arrived at the party as the lights were coming on. He was at the peak of his powers, a world-class drummer with a taste of the big time. And now suddenly he was unemployed. He returned to Melbourne, cast back down to earth after flying so high so fast. The thought of returning to the pub circuit was daunting. He was a world-class drummer at a dangerous crossroads, his future a great, terrifying unknown. He didn't have to wait long. A few weeks later, the phone rang. It was Neil Finn. He told Paul he was putting a new band together, something different, something more stripped back and personal. He had another Melbourne musician, the artist Nick Seymour, lined up to play bass. They had a handful of new songs, a shared vision, and a powerful chemistry. But they were missing one crucial piece. They were missing a heartbeat. Neil asked Paul if he wanted to be their drummer. It wasn't even a question. It was a new beginning, the start of a journey that none of them could have possibly imagined. The three of them were about to build a house, and the entire world was going to be invited inside. When the phone rang in Paul Hester's Melbourne home in late 1984, it was more than just a job offer. It was a lifeline. He was a musician at a dangerous crossroads, having tasted the dizzying heights of life in a major band with split ends, only to be dropped back down to earth with a thud when they disbanded. The future was a great, terrifying unknown. The call from Neil Finn wasn't just an invitation to join a new project. It was a validation. It was the quiet, brilliant songwriter he respected most in the world telling him, "You're my guy. You're the one I need." For Paul, there was no hesitation. This was it. This was the next chapter. The project didn't even have a proper name yet. It was just three men, three distinct personalities coming together with a shared, unspoken understanding that they might have something special. There was Neil, the prodigy, a man whose head was so full of beautiful, melancholic melodies that they seemed to simply spill out of him. There was Nick Seymour, the bassist, but also so much more. He was an artist, a visual thinker, a bohemian with an eccentric flair who would become the band's aesthetic architect, shaping their album covers, their stage designs, and their quirky op-shop fashion sense. And then there was Paul. Paul was the extrovert, the social engine, the man whose boundless energy and earthy humor served as the perfect counterbalance to Neil's quiet introspection. He was the heartbeat, the jester, and the soul. They convened in Melbourne, setting up in a cramped, stuffy rehearsal room. The early days were a blur of pure, unadulterated creativity. There were no record company executives looking over their shoulders, no tour schedules to meet, no expectations to live up to. It was just the three of them making a noise, chasing ideas, and rediscovering the simple joy of playing music. Neil would bring in the skeleton of a song, a chord progression, a vocal melody, and the three of them would flesh it out. Nick would find a bass line that was both melodic and anchoring, a counterpoint to the vocal. And Paul would listen. He would listen intently to the emotional core of the lyric, to the rhythm of Neil's acoustic guitar, and he would build a drum part from the inside out. He wasn't just a timekeeper, he was a musical architect. On a driving, upbeat song, he would push the beat, injecting it with an infectious energy. On a ballad, he would hang back, using the space between the notes as an instrument itself, his gentle brushed snare and shimmering cymbals creating a canvas for Neil's delicate melodies. It was here, in this humble rehearsal space, that the signature Crowded House sound was born, a perfect, bittersweet blend of gorgeous melody, thoughtful lyrics, and a deep, empathetic groove. The chemistry was instantaneous and undeniable. They were more than a band. They were a gang, a tight-knit unit with a shared sense of humor and a fierce belief in the songs they were creating. But they all knew that Melbourne, as vibrant as its scene was, could only take them so far. Australia was still a musical backwater in the eyes of the global industry. If they were going to take these songs to the world, they had to conquer the industry's nerve center. They had to go to America. Specifically, they had to go to Los Angeles. It was a monumental gamble. They would be leaving behind their families, their friends, and the relative comfort of being known quantities in their hometown scene. In Los Angeles, they would be utterly anonymous, just another hopeful trio in a city teeming with thousands of them. They scraped together what little money they had, packed their bags and their instruments, and flew across the Pacific to chase a dream that had devoured so many before them. They found a small, cheap rental house in the Hollywood Hills, a place so tiny that the three of them were practically living on top of one another. The living conditions were a constant, cramped reminder of their humble status. But it was in that little house that they found their name. Looking around at their close quarters one day, Nick Seymour wryly remarked on the state of their crowded house. It stuck. It was perfect. It captured the intimacy, the camaraderie, and the slight sense of chaos that defined their existence. Life in Los Angeles was a brutal education in the realities of the music business. Their days were spent in a soul-crushing cycle of sending out demo tapes and trying to secure meetings with A&R executives, the industry gatekeepers, who held the keys to the kingdom. The LA music scene of the mid-1980s was dominated by the bombast of hair metal and the slick synthesized sheen of new wave pop. Crowded House, with their classic melody-driven songs, their acoustic textures, and their complete lack of spandex and hairspray, simply didn't fit. They would walk into sterile corporate offices and play their hearts out for executives who would listen with blank expressions, tapping their pens before delivering a soul-crushing verdict. It's good, but we don't know how to market it. Where's the gimmick? You guys are from Australia? The rejections piled up. The initial excitement and optimism began to curdle into doubt and frustration. The city, which had once seemed like a land of opportunity, now felt like a fortress with its gates firmly closed. It was during this period of intense pressure and repeated failure that Paul Hester's role in the band became more crucial than ever. Neil, as the principal songwriter, felt the weight of the rejection most acutely. He would retreat into himself, questioning his own abilities. It was Paul who refused to let the despair take root. He was the band's cheerleader, its therapist, its comic relief. When the mood grew dark, Paul would be the one to crack a stupid joke, to suggest a ridiculous outing, to remind them of the absurdity of their situation. He used his humor as a weapon against the encroaching darkness, keeping their spirits afloat when it felt like they were sinking. He was the one who insisted that they weren't just a band, but a family, and that they would get through this together. Without his relentless optimism and emotional resilience during those lean months in Hollywood, it's entirely possible that Crowded House would have simply imploded before they ever even made a record. Finally, after months of knocking on doors, a chink of light appeared. An insightful A&R executive at Capitol Records heard the timeless quality in their demo and, against all odds, fought to get them a record deal. He heard the classic songwriting, the incredible voice, the undeniable chemistry. He heard past the lack of a fashionable gimmick and recognized the timeless quality of the music. He fought for them within the corporate structure and, against all odds, got them a record deal. The sense of relief was tidal. They had done it. They had survived the L.A. gauntlet. Now all they had to do was make an album that lived up to the promise of their songs. Capitol paired them with a producer named Mitchell Froom, a musician known for his love of organic vintage keyboard sounds and his quirky, intelligent production style. It was an inspired choice. Froome didn't try to force the band into a trendy 80s sounding box. Instead, he helped them enhance what was already there, adding subtle layers of Hammond organ, Wurlitzer electric piano, and other atmospheric textures that complemented the warmth of Neil's songwriting. The recording sessions for their debut album Crowded House were intense and focused. This was their one shot, and they knew it. They poured every ounce of their energy, their hope, and their talent into the recordings. Paul's drumming was a revelation. Guided by Froome, he crafted parts that were models of taste and restraint. He laid down a deep, solid groove on rockers, like Mean to Me, provided a buoyant, infectious shuffle for something so strong. And on the ballads, he was a master of subtlety, his gentle, precise playing creating a sense of space and longing. When the album was finished, they knew they had created something special, something that was honest and true to their vision. They had made a great record. Now they just had to hope the world would listen. It didn't. The self-titled album was released in 1986 to almost complete public indifference. It received some positive reviews, but in a market saturated with bigger, flashier acts, it simply failed to find an audience. The record company's initial enthusiasm waned, and the album quickly began to sink without a trace. For the band, it was a devastating blow. They had come so far, worked so hard, and it seemed like it had all been for nothing, but they weren't ready to give up. Capitol agreed to fund one last-ditch effort, a grueling, low-budget tour across North America. They were sent out in a cramped van, playing to tiny clubs and bars, often as the opening act for other, more established bands. The tour was a brutal, humbling experience. They drove for hours on end through the vast, empty landscapes of the American Midwest, sleeping in cheap roadside motels and playing their hearts out to rooms that were often half empty. This was the ultimate test of their resolve. The glamour of being signed to a major label had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of the road. The exhaustion was constant, the food was terrible, and the money was non-existent. Tempers frayed. The close quarters of the van became a pressure cooker. Yet, it was on this punishing tour that they truly became a band. On stage, night after night, they honed their performance into a powerful, cohesive unit, and Paul once again was the engine. He had been through this before in the pubs of Melbourne, and he knew how to win over a skeptical crowd. His energy was infectious, his humor disarming. He would chat with the audience between songs, tell jokes, and make people feel like they were part of the show. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build a small but passionate following, winning fans over one city at a time. They had been on the road for the better part of a year. The album was commercially dead, their funds were exhausted, and the record company was on the verge of dropping them. They were beaten, broke, and ready to admit defeat and fly home. And then a miracle happened, and then a miracle happened. It started small with a handful of curious radio programmers across America deciding to give one of the album's ballads a spin. The song was a dreamy, hauntingly beautiful track with a soaring chorus and a message of defiant hope. It was called Don't Dream It's Over. The station's phone lines lit up. The song was added to the regular rotation. Other stations in the region caught on. A wildfire had been lit. The song's growth was completely organic, a true word-of-mouth phenomenon that bypassed the usual industry hype machine. Within a matter of weeks, it was being played on stations across the country. Capitol Records, seeing the unexpected explosion, threw their marketing weight behind it. A beautifully shot music video went into heavy rotation on MTV. Suddenly, a song that had been declared dead on arrival, was climbing the Billboard charts. For the band, who were still out on the road in their tiny van, the experience was utterly surreal. They would walk into a greasy spoon diner in the middle of nowhere and hear their own song playing on the jukebox. They were becoming famous, but they were still living the life of struggling musicians. The song kept climbing. Top 40, top 20, top 10. In April of 1987, nearly a year after the album's release, Don't Dream It's Over peaked at number 2 in America. It became a global anthem, a song that defined a moment in time for millions of people. Crowded House were, against all possible odds, one of the biggest bands in the world. The success was dizzying, disorienting, and wonderful. They went from playing to 50 people in a dive bar to headlining theaters and arenas. Their album, which had been languishing in bargain bins, shot up the charts and went platinum. Their lives were transformed overnight, but with that success came a new and intense set of pressures. The world now had expectations. They were no longer the scrappy underdogs. They were international pop stars, and they had to prove it wasn't a fluke. They returned to the studio with Mitchell Froom to record their second album, the follow-up, that would determine whether they were a one-hit wonder or a career band. The pressure was immense, and it manifested in the music. The resulting album, 1988's Temple of Low Men, was a world away from the sunny optimism that had permeated much of their debut. It was a darker, moodier, and more complex record. Neil Finn's songwriting had turned inward, exploring themes of doubt, anxiety, and the dislocating nature of fame. Songs like the ferocious rocker When You Come and the achingly beautiful ballad Into Temptation were fraught with a tension and cynicism that reflected their new reality. For Paul, the experience of sudden fame was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. He was a rock star, adored by fans around the world. But the constant demands of touring, the endless promotional duties, and the loss of anonymity began to wear on him. He was a homebody by nature, a man who thrived on the simple comforts of his life in Melbourne, surrounded by his friends and family. The life of a global touring musician was one of perpetual motion and intense loneliness, a world of anonymous hotel rooms and fleeting connections. It was during this period that the black moods, as Neil Finn would later call them, began to manifest more frequently. The jovial, life-of-the-party persona that the public saw was becoming a heavy mask to wear. Privately, he was struggling with bouts of depression, a darkness that was at odds with the bright, happy world he was supposed to inhabit. The higher the band soared, the more the pressure mounted, and the wider the chasm grew between the public, Paul Hester, and the private one. They had proven they could conquer the world, but the battle for their own souls was just beginning. They had solidified their place on the world stage, but the foundations of their own crowded house were beginning to show the strain. By the end of the 1980s, Crowded House had achieved something remarkable. They had survived the treacherous currents of the music industry, dodged the curse of the one-hit wonder, and proven themselves to be a band of profound substance and artistry. Their second album, the dark and intricate Temple of Low Men, had solidified their reputation with critics and cemented a passionate global fan base. They were no longer the scrappy underdogs from down under. They were established, respected, and successful. But success in the world of music is not a destination. It's a landscape, and it comes with its own treacherous terrain. The relentless cycle of recording and touring that had propelled them to the top had also left them depleted. After years on the road, the initial thrill had been replaced by a wearying sense of exhaustion. They were creatively drained and, for the first time, A sense of distance had begun to creep in between the three men who had once been an inseparable unit. They took a much-needed break, retreating to their respective corners of the world to decompress and reconnect with their lives outside the band. For Neil Finn, this period of rest was also a period of creative uncertainty. The wellspring of songs which had always flowed so effortlessly seemed to be running dry. He was struggling to write for Crowded House, feeling the immense pressure to create the next chapter for a band that the world was now watching intently. It was in this state of creative limbo that he turned to a familiar foundational source of inspiration, his older brother, Tim. Tim Finn was and is a titan of New Zealand music. He was the visionary founder of Split Enz, the band that had given both Neil and Paul their first taste of the big time. Theirs was a classic sibling dynamic, a complex brew of deep love, mutual respect, and a healthy dose of rivalry. Tim was the trailblazer, the charismatic frontman. Neil was the quiet younger brother who had emerged from his shadow to become one of the most revered songwriters of his generation. They decided to try writing together again, not for Crowded House, but for a separate, more intimate project they would simply call the Finn Brothers. The collaboration was an immediate success. Working together away from the pressures and expectations of their respective careers unlocked something new. The songs poured out of them, brilliant, hook-laden, and full of the magical, almost telepathic vocal harmonies that only siblings can create. They were crafting an album's worth of material that was, by any measure, extraordinary. And as the project grew, a complicated and momentous idea began to take shape. What if this wasn't a side project? What if these songs, and what if Tim himself were meant for Crowded House? It was a decision fraught with peril. The core of Crowded House had always been the sacred chemistry of the trio. Neil, Nick, and Paul were a perfectly balanced ecosystem. They had a nonverbal understanding, an intuitive way of playing and being together that had been forged in the crucible of their early struggles in Los Angeles. To introduce a new member, even one as talented and familiar as Tim Finn, was to risk upsetting that delicate balance forever. For Paul and Nick, it was a complex proposition. On one hand, Tim was bringing a collection of undeniable world-class songs that could revitalize the band and propel them to even greater heights. On the other, he was an outsider to their gang. The unspoken rules, the in-jokes, the shared history. He wasn't a part of it. The dynamic was about to change, fundamentally and irrevocably. After much soul-searching, they made the leap. Tim Finn officially joined Crowded House, and the band, now a four-piece, entered the studio to create what would become their accidental masterpiece. The resulting album, 1991's Woodface, was a landmark. It was the sound of a band reborn, infused with a new energy and a breathtaking melodic richness. The combination of Neil and Tim's songwriting and the telepathic blend of their voices was pure magic. The album was an embarrassment of riches, a collection of perfectly crafted pop songs that were both instantly accessible and emotionally resonant. From the buoyant, infectious energy of It's Only Natural to the gorgeous, heartbreaking simplicity of 4 seasons in one day, the album was a triumph from start to finish. Paul Hester's drumming on Woodface is some of the finest work of his career. He was the anchor that kept the often complex and layered vocal arrangements from floating away. On a song like the timeless ballad Fall at Your Feet, his playing is a study in masterful restraint. He creates a groove that is so simple, so solid, and so deeply empathetic to the lyric that it feels less like a drum part and more like a supportive embrace. You can feel the sadness and the hope in the very rhythm he lays down. And then there was Weather With You, a breezy, optimistic, and ridiculously catchy song. It would become their biggest international hit, a song that seemed to be playing on every radio station in every corner of the globe throughout 1991 and 1992. Paul's contribution is iconic. The driving, almost shuffling beat he provides is the engine of the song, creating a sense of forward momentum, of a journey on an open road. It's a joyful, powerful, and utterly perfect performance. Woodface propelled Crowded House into the stratosphere. They were no longer just a successful band, they were global superstars, particularly in the UK and across Europe, where the album was a multi-platinum behemoth. They embarked on a massive world tour, graduating from theaters to arenas, headlining festivals to colossal crowds. From the outside, it looked like a victory lap. They were at the absolute zenith of their power and popularity, a band at the peak of its creative and commercial prowess. But inside the machine, the gears were beginning to grind. The four-piece lineup, which had looked so perfect on paper and sounded so brilliant on the record, was not built to last on the road. The tour was a study in simmering tension. The delicate alchemy of the band had been thrown off balance. Tim, who had spent his entire career as a frontman and a band leader, struggled to find his place as just one of four members in a band that was, by now, unquestionably Neil's creative vehicle. It was no one's fault. It was simply a matter of chemistry. The easy, unspoken camaraderie of the original trio was a closed circle. The nonverbal cues, the shared history forged in that tiny LA house. It was a language Tim didn't speak. As Nick Seymour later put it, the three of them could communicate with just a look, whereas with Tim, everything had to be explained. The friction grew. The joy of playing began to be replaced by the stress of navigating complex personal dynamics. A few months into the world tour, the inevitable happened. After a show in the UK, the band had a meeting, and the difficult, painful truth was acknowledged by everyone. It just wasn't working. In a decision that was more sad than angry, Tim Finn left the band. The great experiment was over. For Paul and Nick, the immediate feeling was one of relief. Their gang was back together. The familiar, comfortable dynamic of the trio was restored. They finished the Woodface tour as a three-piece, tighter and more focused than ever. But the experience had left its mark. The cracks had been exposed. They had reached the pinnacle of success, looked out over the world from the top of the mountain, and found that the view wasn't as serene as they had imagined. Determined to recapture the spirit of their early days and escape the sterile environment of conventional recording studios, they made a radical decision for their next album. They would retreat from the world, setting up a makeshift studio in a remote, ruggedly beautiful beach location in New Zealand called Karakare. It was a place of wild, untamed nature, black sand beaches, crashing surf, and lush, dense rainforest. Their plan was to live and work in this isolated environment, to let the landscape seep into their music, and to reconnect with the elemental, intuitive spirit of the band. The result was 1993's Together Alone. It is arguably Crowded House's most ambitious and artistically adventurous work. The album is atmospheric, experimental, and deeply textured. You can hear the influence of the wild landscape in every note. The sound is spacious and elemental, incorporating the sounds of a local Maori log drumming group, which added a primal rhythmic depth to the music. The title itself was a perfect, poignant summary of the band's state of being. They were a unit, a family, working together in this remote idyll, yet each member was increasingly isolated in their own internal world. Paul's contribution to Together Alone was immense. This was him at his most creative and musically curious. He wasn't just keeping time, he was exploring sound and texture on a sprawling psychedelic track like Private Universe. His drumming is a whirlwind of intricate, polyrhythmic patterns. a testament to his ever-expanding musical vocabulary. He was pushing himself and the band into new territory. But while he was reaching new heights of artistic expression, his personal life was becoming increasingly fraught. The brief, exhilarating high of the Woodface success had long since faded, replaced once again by the relentless, soul-crushing grind of the touring machine. The primary source of his anguish was the growing distance from his family. He was now a father to a young daughter, and every day spent in a different city on the other side of the world was a day he was missing her grow up. The joy he had once found in performing was being systematically eroded by a profound sense of homesickness and a growing resentment for the demands of his job. The black moods were no longer just occasional visitors. They were becoming a constant, unwelcome companion. The disconnect between his public persona and his private struggle was becoming a crushing weight, and the cracks were beginning to show. His bandmates could see the toll it was taking. The laughter in his eyes was often gone, replaced by a haunted, weary look. He was physically present on stage, but his spirit seemed to be somewhere else entirely. He was a man being pulled in two opposing directions: his love for the band and the music they created, and his desperate, all-consuming need for the stability and normalcy of home. And the tension was becoming unbearable. The tour for Together Alone was another long, grueling trek across the globe. The band was firing on all cylinders musically, delivering powerful, transcendent performances night after night. But offstage, they were falling apart. The communication had broken down, the joy was gone, replaced by a grim sense of professional obligation. For Paul, every show felt less like a celebration and more like a sentence. He had lost his connection to the music, to the audience, and ultimately to the very reason he had started doing this in the first place. It wasn't fun anymore. It was a job, and a job he had come to despise. The breaking point finally came in April of 1994 during a tour stop in Atlanta, Georgia. There was no dramatic fight, no explosive confrontation. It was something much quieter and much sadder. After a show, Paul walked off stage, went back to his hotel room, and made a phone call. He told the band's tour manager that he was done. He couldn't do it for one more night. He was going home. Neil and Nick were blindsided and devastated. As Neil Finn would later recount, they rushed to his hotel room and spent hours trying to talk him out of it. They pleaded with him, telling him they could cancel the rest of the tour, take a long break, do whatever it took to make things right. But Paul's decision was absolute. His spirit was broken. In his own mind, he was no longer a musician. He was just an employee in a machine that was slowly crushing him. He saw only one way out. His departure was not a malicious act. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. He was choosing his sanity. He was choosing his family. He was choosing to try and save himself from a darkness that was threatening to consume him completely. He packed his bags, flew out of Atlanta the next morning, and left the massive grinding machinery of Crowded House to seize up in his absence. The band, his family for the better part of a decade, was left shocked, heartbroken, and in disarray, its future completely uncertain. Paul Hester was flying home to Melbourne, back to the life he had craved for so long. He had escaped the cage, but the most dangerous cages are not the ones that surround us. They are the ones we carry inside ourselves. He had left the biggest band in Australia, but could he leave behind the depression that had followed him to the very top of the world? He had chosen to save himself, but the question that lingered in the silence of his departure was a haunting one. What if it was already too late? When Paul Hester stepped onto that plane in Atlanta in April of 1994, he wasn't just leaving a tour. He was detonating a bomb in the center of his own life and walking away from the blast. Behind him, He left the multi-platinum, globe-trotting entity known as Crowded House in a state of shock and disarray. Neil Finn and Nick Seymour were left to pick up the pieces. Forced to finish the tour with a replacement drummer, the heart and soul of their band suddenly, inexplicably gone. The music press was filled with speculation, creative differences, personal issues, the usual vague industry euphemisms that mask a deeper, more painful truth. But for Paul, the chaos he left behind was a world away. As his plane touched down in Melbourne, he was met not with headlines and questions, but with the quiet, comforting embrace of the life he had so desperately missed. The feeling must have been a complex cocktail of profound relief and a terrifying sense of loss. He had escaped the machine, but in doing so, he had also shed a core part of his identity. For over a decade, he had been Paul Hester, drummer for Crowded House. Now, he was just Paul, and he had to figure out who that person was. He threw himself into the life he had sacrificed so much to reclaim. His primary focus, the very reason for his dramatic departure, was his family. He was now a present and devoted father to his 2 young daughters, Sunday and Olive. He was there for the school runs, the bedtime stories, the small, mundane, and beautiful moments of domestic life that he had once only experienced through a crackly, long-distance phone line. For a man who was at his core a homebody, this was a period of genuine grounding. The roar of the crowd was replaced by the laughter of his children, and for a time it seemed to be a healing balm. He also made a conscious effort to reconnect with his community, to build a life that was deliberately, almost defiantly, normal. He invested in a local cafe and tea house in the beachside suburb of Elwood, a place where he could be a small business owner, not a rock star. It was a place where he could chat with the regulars, pour coffee, and simply be a part of the neighborhood fabric. It was a symbolic act, a reclaiming of his identity as a Melbourne local, a man of the people. Of course, music was too deeply ingrained in his DNA to ever abandon it completely. He formed a new band, a casual, fun-loving outfit he called The Largest Living Things. The name itself was a classic piece of Hester humor, self-deprecating and quirky. The band was a deliberate and therapeutic step down from the high-stakes world of Crowded House. There were no major label pressures, no grueling world tours, no expectations of platinum sales. It was about the pure, simple joy of playing music with friends in local pubs. It was a return to his roots, to the sticky carpet stages where his journey had begun. The music was loose, energetic, and fun, a reflection of the creative freedom he was now enjoying. He found another outlet for his unique charisma on television. He became the host of a wonderfully eccentric variety show on Australia's ABC network called Hesse's Shed. The concept was pure Paul. The show was broadcast from a literal shed in his own backyard. It was the antithesis of slick, polished television. It was informal, warm, and gloriously shambolic. He would interview fellow musicians, comedians, and local characters, all with a sense of genuine curiosity and infectious humor. Hesse's Shed was a perfect manifestation of his personality. It allowed him to be the entertainer, the host, the funny man, but on his own terms, in his own space with no script and no pretense. To the outside world, it seemed that Paul Hester had successfully navigated the treacherous transition from global rock stardom to a happy, fulfilling, and creatively rich post-fame life. He seemed to have found a measure of peace. 2 years after his departure in 1996, the call came from Neil Finn. Crowded House, having limped on without him, had decided to officially end it. The magic of the original trio was gone, and Neil knew it was time to close the book. But he wanted to do it properly. He wanted to give the band and its legion of fans one final monumental send-off, a free concert on the steps of the iconic Sydney Opera House. It would be a celebration, a thank you, and a goodbye. And for it to be right, for it to be a true farewell, there was only one person who could be behind the drums. Neil asked Paul if he would come back for one last show. For Paul, the decision must have been layered with complexity, but it was also a chance for closure, an opportunity to end his chapter with the band not on a note of pained exhaustion in a lonely Atlanta hotel room, but on a triumphant, celebratory high. It was a chance to stand with his brothers one last time and reclaim his part of their shared history. He said yes. The event, which took place on November the 24th, 1996, was dubbed Farewell to the World, and it has since passed into Australian legend. The scale of it was staggering. An official crowd estimated at over 100,000 people crammed into the forecourt of the Opera House, a vast sea of humanity that spilled out into the surrounding parks and streets, with millions more watching live on television. The atmosphere was electric, a potent mix of joy, nostalgia, and a collective sense of grief for the end of a beloved era. And then they walked on stage, Neil, Nick, and Paul, the original three. The roar from the crowd was deafening, a wave of pure love and adoration. And as they launched into their opening song, it was clear that the magic was still there, undiminished by time or turmoil. For 2.5 hours, they played a transcendent set, a journey through their incredible songbook, and at the center of it all was Paul. He was magnificent. He played with a power, a grace, and a joy that was breathtaking to behold. The familiar, irrepressible grin was back on his face. He was in his element. The very pulse of the band made flesh, driving them with a ferocious energy. He joked with the crowd, engaged in the familiar, hilarious banter with Neil, and for that one night, it was as if all the darkness and pain had simply melted away. Watching him that night, it was impossible not to feel that he was healed, that he had found his way back. The concert was more than just a gig. It was a catharsis, a beautiful, emotional, and seemingly perfect ending to one of the great stories in music. It was a moment of grace. The band took their final bow, locked in an emotional embrace, having given the world one last perfect memory. It was, in every sense of the word, closure. But the problem with perfect endings is that life doesn't stop when the credits roll. The euphoric high of the farewell concert couldn't last forever. Back in the quiet reality of his life in Melbourne, Paul's old adversary was waiting for him. Depression is not a situational illness. It is not cured by a single night of triumph. It is a chronic clinical condition, a relentless black dog, as Winston Churchill called it, that follows you even in the brightest of sunlight. In the years that followed, Paul continued to build his life. He was a loving father, a respected member of his community, and a creative force. But he was also fighting a war that few could see. The greatest blow came in the early 2000s, when his long-term relationship with Marty Sommerfeld, the mother of his daughters, came to an end. For a man who craved stability and whose identity was so deeply intertwined with his role as a family man, the separation was a devastating untethering event. The primary anchor that had held him steady through the storms was gone. His friends and family grew increasingly concerned. The black moods became more frequent and more severe. The light in his eyes, which had shone so brightly on that Sydney stage, was dimming. He was in and out of therapy, bravely fighting a battle against his own brain chemistry, but the illness was tightening its grip. He was becoming more isolated, retreating from the world. The man who had once been the life of every party was now struggling just to leave his house. The great communicator, the man who could make 20,000 people feel like his friends, could not find the words to articulate the depth of his own pain. On the evening of March 26, 2005, Paul Hester took his two beloved dogs for a walk in Elsternwick Park, a familiar green space near his home. It was a simple, routine act, one he had performed 1,000 times before. But on this night, he did not return. The next morning, his body was found. Paul had taken his own life. He was 46 years old. The news was a seismic shock. It ripped through Australia and the music world with a brutal, sickening force. It seemed impossible, incomprehensible. How could this be? How could Paul Hester, the embodiment of joy, the man whose laughter was a national soundtrack, be gone? The grief was immediate and overwhelming. Tributes poured in from around the world. But the most poignant words came from his heartbroken friend and musical soulmate, Neil Finn. "I am lost for words," he wrote in a simple, devastating statement. "I am so deeply saddened by the loss of my dear friend. I will be forever grateful to him for the beautiful music we made together, the joy and the laughter. He was a good man." The silence left by the absence of his beat was deafening. But in the wake of the tragedy, a new conversation began. Paul's death forced Australia to confront the issue of male depression and suicide in a way it never had before. His story became a tragic but powerful catalyst, helping to tear down the very stigma of silence and stoicism that had likely contributed to his suffering. The man who had brought so much joy in life, in death, brought a new and desperately needed awareness. 2 years later, Neil Finn and Nick Seymour, still processing their grief, made the decision to reform Crowded House. It was not an attempt to replace Paul. They knew that would be impossible. It was instead an act of healing, a way to honor his memory and to keep the music they had created together alive. Neil would later speak of feeling Paul's presence on stage with them during their comeback tour, a friendly ghost giving him a nod of approval, a push to carry on. The band continues to this day, a living testament to an enduring legacy, but for anyone who knew them in their first incarnation, there will always be an empty space on that stage, a missing heartbeat. The legacy of Paul Hester is not written on a chart of hit singles or a list of platinum albums. It is found in the intangible, in the memories of 1 million fans who left his shows with a smile on their face. It's in the powerful, empathetic groove of "Fall at Your Feet," the joyful driving rhythm of "Weather with You," and the heartbreaking subtle pulse of "Don't Dream It's Over." He was the rare drummer who understood that what you don't play is just as important as what you do. He served the song, always. But more than that, his is a human legacy. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of our heroes, a reminder that the brightest smiles can hide the most profound pain. He was the clown who made the world laugh while his own heart was breaking. He was the man who gave so much joy to so many, but who in the end could not save enough for himself. His story forces us to look past the performance and see the person, to listen for the silence between the notes. In the end, the music remains. We can still listen to those records and be transported. We can still hear that perfect, steady beat, the sound of a man who, for a few hours every night, was able to conquer his demons and create something truly beautiful. The laughter has faded, but its echo will last forever. And in that echo, Paul Hester is still with us, forever young, forever smiling, and forever keeping time.